earlier that a couple by last week, that is on purpose, efficacy of repentance. And so one of their own and somebody done on purpose. Okay, we're on page 8, but I may not have given you page 8 if you didn't bring it with you, because I put them together from page 9, but I have a few more page 8s if people don't have it. At the bottom of the page. You have it? Here, you can hold on to all of them. If anybody else comes in, you can give it to them. Okay, just at the bottom. I want to thank you because it's been fun to do this, and at least on Tuesday nights for an hour and a half, it's allowed me to engage my brain, to put it in gear in a different way than what I've mostly been thinking about for the last month, for the last 3 weeks. So that's one of the downsides or upsides, depending on your point of view, of being retired, is you have time to read all sorts of things that you didn't used to have time to read, and so therefore you are engaged in a way that is we're going to get to those in a second. Okay, at the bottom, you see where it says Brachot 33b? The story of a reader who went down before the ark in the presence of Rabbi Hanina, and said, "O God, great, mighty, awesome, majestic, powerful, feared, strong, overwhelming, reliable, and honored." Rabbi Hanina waited until the reader finished. Then when he finished, he asked him, "Have you concluded all the words of praise to be accorded to your master, to God? Why did you have to voice so many? We would not have been allowed to utter even the 3. What are the 3 that we say? Great, mighty, and awesome, right? We would not have been allowed to utter even those 3. We do utter them. Let me try that again. We would not have been allowed to utter even the 3 great, mighty, and awesome that are included in the first blessing of the tefillah that we do utter, had not Moses, our teacher, mentioned them in the Torah, and had not the men of the great synagogue come and included them in the tefillah. Yet, you not only uttered the 3, but went on and on and on. So what is the problem? Now you have to go to the pages that I handed out to you, page 9. What is the problem? What difference does it make if somebody stands in front of the ark for the tefillah and gets carried away by all the adjectives that one could attach to God? What's the problem? Rena knows because she read ahead. I could see it in your eyes. So what happens when you read ahead? What do you find out? It is as if the king of flesh and blood had 1,000 gold dinars and was praised for possessing silver ones. Think about this. Would it be a compliment to say to a king, "King, you are so wealthy, you have 100,000 silver pieces," when in fact the king has 100,000 gold pieces? It would be an insult, right? The king would get angry. Well, to start to say praises of God is like talking to God about his silver pieces. God's silver pieces. Because you couldn't possibly say enough things to cover God's greatness. And the Midrash is telling us we get to say the 3 adjectives that we get to say because they've been ordained by the tradition. Do you follow that? Great, mighty, and awesome. If you say any more, let me take the question and then I'll try it a different way. The question is whether the other words that he uttered, the other words of praise, Now, that's the analogy. The point is, any words are lesser. Any words are lesser. We are privileged, we are allowed, because we are human beings who have to say what we can say, to say the three. To say any more is chutzpahdik. Let me see if I can give you another. The more important the person, the shorter the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. And if you were to say more, like, and he started out as mayor of Scranton and then moved to, what would that be doing? It would be belittling and diminishing. The more you say, the worse it gets. Do you follow what they're trying to say? Is that you cannot contain God with words. Be happy that the tradition is giving you some words to say. But understand that these words do not encompass God. They don't cover the subject. They're just merely a way of speaking, that you have to say something. Otherwise, and I've said this before, half in jest, but half seriously, the most serious prayer, in my opinion, would be silence. But that doesn't work. Not if you want to build a community. You have to have words that everybody can say together, that they can share. Yes? Oh, there's plenty of them. So Kaddish, first of all, the rabbis would never, I don't think, would ever use Kaddish as an example. I think I've told this to you before. Kaddish is in Aramaic. That's a dead giveaway that it's not a rabbinic prayer. That this is, meaning it's not something that they sanctioned, created, were in favor of. It grew up out of Amcha, out of the people. And generally, so like Kol Nidre, which is also in Aramaic, was not a, at least early on, was not a rabbinic favorite. Kol Nidre becomes important in the Middle Ages, and then later. It's the same kind of thing. So you are absolutely right. There is a string of adjectives in Kaddish, but I don't know that they would use that as an example. That's just my guess. But this Midrash is trying to make a point about our relationship with God. That because we are human, we have to use human speech, and so we have to use these words, but we should understand that at best they are metaphoric. God is greater than any kind of words that we could utilize. And we don't want to insult God. Yes? You could say that. Yes, you can say that. So there's lots of names for God. The ones that I like best are words that are vague. So one of the names for God is Makom, which means place. You have to fill in what you think that means. Okay. Any other comments about this? I think we got the point. I don't want to belabor it because I want to go to number 29. Okay. So now there's a real question about Jewish identity. What makes the Jewish people the Jewish people? How are we different? How are we set apart? Remember, that's what Balaam says to the Israelites in the desert. You know, we like to begin services with it. Ma tovu o'alecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Israel, your dwelling places, O Jacob. But later on he says, and you will be a people that lives alone. Is that a positive or a negative? So in Tanchuma Buber, I talked about this last time, that this is the collection of Tanchuma that was developed and edited by Buber. I believe it's Martin Buber's grandfather, but I can't swear to that. My memory just doesn't hold. That's why it's called Tanchuma Buber. The Holy One foresaw that the nations of the world would get to translate the Torah And reading it in Greek would declare, we are Israel. Did that happen? It did happen. It did happen. There's an entire strain of Christianity that considers themselves the new Israel. It's a kind of supersessionist interpretation of Christianity that understands that Israel is the root, but then out of whatever reason, stubbornness, whatever, refuse to get on with the program and are on the side, and that the real Israel is now the church. You even can see this even further, if you want to see a further development of this, just occurred to me. That's what the whole Mormon idea is. That they're the new Israel. Okay, so this idea is not ridiculous. This happened. And to this day, the scales appear to be evenly balanced between both claims. But then the Holy One says to the nations of the world, you claim you are my children. I have no way of knowing other than that my children are those who possess my secret lore. What secret lore? The Mishnah. What's the Mishnah? First code of rabbinic law. Part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, which was given by word of mouth. For us, we claim there are two Torahs, right? Torah Shebichtav, Torah in writing. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then the rest of the Hebrew Bible eventually falls under that category. And then there's the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Torah that comes from the mouth, that is orally transmitted, which is the whole rabbinic transmission material. And so, what makes the Jewish people the Jewish people? Torah, in the sense of Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is a very big deal, if you think about this. Look, everybody's got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Everybody can lay claim to that. But we have this additional revelation which marks us in terms of our relationship with God. Yeah, that's correct. Does everybody know what Rita is talking about? That during, there was these two operations, Moses and Solomon, that took place 1990. In which Ethiopian Jews were airlifted out of Ethiopia and brought to Israel, large numbers. Like in a 36-hour period, I think they brought 30,000 or something in one of those operations. Why did it take so long for that to happen, is the way I put it. It is because there was a debate in Israel whether they were really Jews, even though the Ethiopian Jews themselves at one point thought they were the only Jews left in the world. But are they really Jews because they're not part of the rabbinic tradition? They don't have a Torah Sheba'al Peh. At least not our Torah Sheba'al Peh. And ultimately, what I think is a legal fiction was created to overcome, to circumvent, to work around that problem, which was that the chief rabbinate agreed that they were actually the tribe of Dan. Dan? Yeah, I think the tribe of Dan. I may have the wrong tribe. But, with the dispersion of the ancient Israelites into that, if you could claim that they were one of those lost tribes, then they have a direct claim, and we can bring them into Israel as Jews. However, not really, because the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel still has a problem with them and often requires them to formally convert before they'll proceed with something like a marriage or any of the life cycle events. A little different. It's on the same spectrum, though. Yeah. Okay. So we all know, now we get the point about Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the Lord said to Moses, write down these words. When the Holy One came to give the Torah to Israel, he uttered it to Moses in its order. What is Torah? Look at the order. Scripture, Mishnah, Talmud, Agadah. That's Midrash. As it is said, the Lord spoke all these words. Even what a faithful student was someday to ask his teacher, the Holy One uttered to Moses at that time. After Moses had learned the Torah, the Holy One said, "Go and teach it to my children." Moses replied, "Master of the universe, write it down for your children." And the Holy One then said, "What do you wish, that the Mishnah should also be written down? Then what would be the difference between Israel and the nations of the world?" With regard to this response, Scripture quotes God as saying, "Had I written the full abundance of my law for him," that's from Hosea, "had I indeed done such a thing, the children of Israel would by now have been accounted as strangers, the same as the nations of the world. Therefore, give them Scripture in writing and Mishnah by word of mouth. Write thou these words, Scripture. Then by these words uttered with the mouth have I made a covenant with thee, these words being Mishnah and Talmud, which make it possible to tell Israel and the nations of the world apart." I would argue that that's still true. That the essential difference, religiously, there's lots of differences, but from a Jewish point of view, is our heritage of oral Torah. I think I said a couple weeks ago, I don't remember now, I say so many things to so many people that I don't remember what I've said to whom. That the essential role that Jesus plays in Christianity is played by Torah in Judaism. And you can almost swap them with each other in terms of their role within religion, that within our religion, God's immanence, the way that we know that God is in contact with us, is through Torah. Christianity, it's through Jesus. The two are almost interchangeable in terms of their role, not what they are. And so, if Torah is that important, there has to be something that is unique about Torah to Jews that is not in common to everyone. And the fact is, the Bible is now in common to everyone, and already was in the time of the rabbis. It was being translated into Greek, right? The Septuagint. So they're acutely aware of this importance. Anybody want to add anything to that? Yeah, that kind of passage is a little different. All right, so what everybody knows the passage that is being referred to? It's the famous passage in which Hillel is challenged, tell me the meaning of Torah while standing on one foot. As if he were a flamingo. Yeah. And no, I guess you could read it either way in terms of this. But Hillel says, essentially a version of the golden rule, stated negatively. What's hateful to you, do not do to other people. And then that's where the story often ends, but actually the story continues and he says to the person, all the rest is commentary, now go and learn it. Which you could interpret, this is what I think Fran was trying to do, as you need to know all the oral tradition that goes with this. Not just the aphorism, not just the nice little sentence. I think that that's correct, but the purpose of that midrash, I think, is something different, which is that Hillel is telling the prospective convert an answer that the convert can hear, as opposed to the whole story. Right? In other words, the whole story begins with the convert going to Shammai, and Shammai essentially pushing him off. And Hillel, the way it's usually interpreted, the way I like to interpret it, listens to what the person is really saying, and then gives an appropriate answer for that person at that time, with the little additional caveat that now you have to go from here to the stuff that really matters. I gave you your answer. It's an important answer. It's a true answer, but there's much, much more. And hopefully now the person's interested enough, right, that's been brought along, and so is now ready to hear the more, as opposed to simply overwhelming the individual from the get-go. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a lesson about most things that if know who you're talking to. Right? This is the problem, dare I say, with most scholars in residence. They know their material, certainly better than I'll probably ever know any material that I use, but that doesn't mean they necessarily understand how to communicate it to non-scholars. And to simply overwhelm people, just the switch goes off. You have to figure out who your audience is and how to reach that audience, and then how to go from there. So I would use that midrash, the one that you brought up, in a different way than you meant it here, but I can see how it works with this subject. Okay, we're on page 10. Now, this is truly a famous midrash. Everybody knows this. Not everybody, but don't be upset if you don't know it. But in the rabbinic world, everybody knows this midrash. If you know like 3 different stories from the Talmud, this is one of them you're going to learn. But it doesn't matter whether you're a Reform rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, Conservative rabbi, Reconstructionist rabbi, any kind of rabbi, you're probably going to know this story. Because everybody wants to use this story. And somehow everybody finds a way to make it justify their position, whatever movement they come from. Okay, so on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought forward all imaginable arguments, but the sages did not accept them. This is an argument over whether a oven is kosher or not. It has to do with the nature of the oven. It's really not important. That's not the essence of the story. But the oven was probably a kind of coil clay oven, and there's an issue. What if you do X, does that make it impure and it can't be used or not? So there is a debate. Eliezer on one side, all the rabbis on the other side. Eliezer is known to be a great, great halachicist. He really knows Jewish law. Everybody agrees with this. Everybody knows how knowledgeable he is. He is one of the standouts of the Rabbinic Academy. They all know that, but they are all disagreeing with him. Does that deter him? Of course not. So he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree moved 100 cubits from its place. Pretty good proof. If I'm right, the carob tree is going to uproot itself and move all the way over there to the courtyard. And then it does. Does that convince the rabbis? And they say, no proof can be brought from a carob tree. Nice trick, Eliezer. Who cares? He goes on. Again, he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream of water flowed backwards. Another miracle. And what do they say? No proof can be brought from a stream of water. Again, we aren't convinced by parlor tricks. Again, he urged, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the schoolhouse prove it. Whereupon the walls inclined and began to fall in on them. But Rabbi Joshua rebuked the walls, saying, when scholars are engaged in halachic dispute, you have no right to interfere. Thereupon, the walls did not fall, in honor of Rabbi Joshua. But they didn't become upright again, in honor of Rabbi Eliezer. And they are still standing that way to this day, as according to the story. But again, he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let it be proved by heaven. God, tell them I'm right. Whereupon a heavenly voice, the Hebrew is bat kol, which is almost always translated as heavenly voice, a clear communication from nothing less than God, cried out, why are you disputing with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that all the matters in halacha agree with him? And what does Rabbi Joshua arise and exclaim? Lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. Think about this for a second. all these miracles, carob trees, streams, walls, a bat call from God saying the rule is according to Rabbi Eliezer. Joshua, representing all of the rabbis, says, tough, God. We have the Torah. Torah is not in heaven anymore. It's not yours. Is that sinking in? The chutzpah here? What did he mean by this? Rabbi Jeremiah said the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice, because you wrote long ago in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority one must incline. That's actually a play on words, because the actual Hebrew says, do not go after the majority. But if you punctuate it differently and you leave the negative out, you get after the majority one is to incline. Okay? And Rabbi Nathan met Elijah and asked him. Remember, Elijah is going to resolve all problems and never died. And at the end of time, we're going to get all of our answers. So Rabbi Natan met Elijah and asked him, what did the Holy One do that hour? Hearing the rabbi's response. And the answer was, God laughed with joy, he replied. My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Ha ha. Okay, what do you make out of this? I told you this is very famous. Everybody uses this story. What does it show? Yes, read it. Okay, so number one, what's going on here, this is a very important point, is this is a story about rabbinic authority. Remember, we take it for granted the rabbis had authority because we're living long after them. In their own time, right, following the destruction of the temple and the priesthood and the offerings and sacrifices, they had to establish their authority. And their authority is all in the oral Torah, right? And so what are they saying here? We don't operate anymore with prophets. We don't ask God for direct instruction anymore. We don't operate with that kind of direct communication from God, and we wait for God to tell us what to do. God told us what we need to know when God gave us the Torah. It's in our hands now. It's up to us to figure out what we're supposed to do. Meaning, we, the rabbis, you have to respect our authority. We're making these decisions. So certainly that's correct. And you can see how Orthodoxy would use this, just take it another step or two from there, that we're the continuation of that rabbinic authority into this day, and still we are the authority figures. That's why Orthodox rabbis would want to use this story. Yes, exactly right. But if the rabbis have that authority, it means they also have the authority to change the rules, even if God doesn't want the rule that change, doesn't want that particular change in rules. Because lo b'shamayim hi, that the Torah is not in heaven. The Torah is in our hands. It's an amazing passage on this score. So liberal rabbis are very concerned with it because it demonstrates our authority. Orthodox rabbis are very connected to it because it establishes their authority. And what it really says, and this is an interesting thing, is that we don't wait for God anymore. God gave us all of the power, if you will, when God revealed the Torah at Sinai. Remember, Torah, written Torah, and oral Torah. When that happened, it was transferred to us. Now we have to figure out what to do with it. This is an amazing amount of freedom, I think. It's also an amazing burden. Right? It's so much easier to just do whatever you think God is telling you to do. You look like you want to say something. Okay. Oh, absolutely. So what Fran is talking about, because Fran, I think this is the correct noun, is a Pittsburgher. Is that what we say? Pittsburghers? Okay. Is that one of what used to be the large Reform, it's no longer the largest, but what used to be the largest Reform synagogue in Pittsburgh has a long history of its rabbis being involved in reform halacha. Under the argument, one of these rabbis is a personal friend of my wife's family, of Simone's family, so we were sort of close with them to a certain extent at one point when we lived in Pennsylvania, is that halacha, the practical ramifications of the oral Torah, is just too important not to engage with it as Reform Jews. Don't leave it to the Orthodox to decide what halacha is from their perspective. If we take this story seriously, right, then we should be engaging with it from our point of view, it meaning halacha, and developing reform halacha. So Freehoff did this for 30 years, writing, 20 books on reform halacha. And his successor, Walter Jacob, he continued that tradition. I don't know, Walter must be responsible for some 20 books also, anyway. In the same vein of trying to utilize the perspective of liberal Judaism, a liberal perspective, to bring that to bear on Jewish tradition in the form of halacha, and then to create guidance through halacha for modern Reform Jews. Intellectually, both of them made major contributions. I would say to the intellectual components of Reform Jews, which means people who like to study and rabbis, they had a very big impact. On ordinary Reform Jews, not so much. Because most Reform Jews believe that the difference between them and Orthodox Jews is that Orthodox Jews follow halacha and Reform Jews don't. That's one way to put it. And so it did not really filter down in the way that they would have liked. The institute that Fran was referring to is Walter created something called the Freehoff Institute, specifically for the advancement of Reform halacha. Anybody else want to say anything about this? Do you like the end, that God laughs? Yeah, I am sure that there were alternatives. Can I document that and show it to you? I can't. But there had to have been. My guess is there had to have been people sacrificing animals in their backyard. Let's find a priest and continue somebody who was a Kohen, and let's continue this. Let's find a way to continue it. Or another group that said we have to rebuild the temple somehow. Maybe we have to move to another city. We have to do something like that. To do something as radical as what the rabbis did, I am sure did not go unchallenged. And the evidence for that is all negative evidence that you can see in these passages where they keep arguing for their own authority. If you have unquestioned authority, you don't need to argue for it. When you find something over and over and over again, it probably means that there's an insecurity there. So I am sure you're correct. I just don't know how to document it. I am unaware of anything that can do that. Okay, we're going to go on. We're going to go on to the next page. To number 36. All these other ones are interesting. I just know that since this is the last time together, I want to look at Nidarim 62a. What does study of the Torah mean? We have been taught the verse that thou may love the Lord thy God, to hearken to God's voice, to cleave unto God, means that one should not say, I will read Scripture so I may be called a sage. I will recite Mishnah so that I might be called master. I will study so that I may be designated an elder or have a seat in the academy. Rather, study out of love and honor will come in the end. So what is Torah study supposed to be? Not for glory. The way you put it, though, you then said, but for yourself. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Okay, so that's one way to view it, that there's a kind of practical thing. Yes? And what do we call that? There's a specific phrase. It's called Torah Lishma. Lishma is not Shema Yisrael. Okay, it's not that Shema. It's the Shem Shelah, which means Torah for its own sake. Not for any practical concern. Not because you want to be a rabbi. In other words, it's counseling against what I did. You don't go to rabbinic school, learn these texts, so that you can then get a job in a congregation. You should be studying because, for its own self, for its own sake. Rita. Yes, because remember what we just said in the terms of the Eliezer story, how do we connect to God? Through the Torah. It's in our hand. That's through study. Did I see a hand over here? Yeah. Okay. Do we really believe that? Okay. So to turn this into a little bit of a contemporary debate. It's a real issue. I don't want to make light of this issue that I'm bringing up. Given the cost of higher education today, is it worth it? Okay. So from my perspective, it's worth it because you go to college to become a better person, to learn. To learn how to think, to learn how to experience things, to all sorts, not as a career path. Now, that position, I see some of you nodding your head, it's a very minority position today. And I believe it grows out of the costs, which I completely understand. We're watching this now in a way that I don't remember watching it for a long time, because our oldest granddaughter is almost 16, which means a year from now she's going to be applying to colleges. And learning even, for example, what Ohio State in-state tuition is. I don't know if any of you know what that is now. It's around 30. Yeah. Okay. So when you start to look at these things in terms of what it costs to go to college, that sort of inevitably leads to the practical question, is this worth it? And from what am I going to get from this in terms of usability in the real world, which translates to some sort of job, remuneration, living, all that kind of thing. Is it worth it? That's one kind of question, which I think are legitimate questions. But this passage is telling us that's not a legitimate question when it comes to Torah. Studying Torah is the way that you approach God. It's like offering the sacrifices in the time of the temple. It's like listening to the prophets in the time of Amos. I mean, this is how we connect to God. And since I buy it, I believe it, because that's what I feel when I am studying Torah. When I'm studying Talmud on Tuesday mornings, some of you know, I study with a group of rabbi friends that we've been friends for well over 50 years. And we're currently studying Tractate Avodah Zarah. And why do we do this? All of us are retired. There is no practical ramifications to any of this. You could say it's about personal edification, but all of us feel, I think, in the study group, I certainly am willing to say this, that I feel much closer and more connected to God when I am studying than when I am praying. Both are considered legitimate avenues, not exclusive to each other, but they can be, it's not either or, it can be both. But that's what study is supposed to be about. And that's what the passage is trying to tell us. This is a very difficult thing in a society where devoting time and energy to study is supposed to have a payoff. Yes. Okay. All right, go ahead, Eric. Well, okay. Does everybody know what Aaron is bringing up? Okay. So Aaron immediately put his finger on taking this to the extreme. Okay. And among the Haredim, who are the ultra-Orthodox, it used to be, like in Eastern Europe, you took the handful, I want to emphasize this, the handful of extraordinary students, and you supported them so that they could spend their life in study. And supporting them was relatively easy. You've all seen Yentl, or you've all seen, one of those. Remember in Yentl how they eat at a different house every day? That's the way it was. In your village, if there were 3 of these students, on Monday they ate lunch at this wealthy person's house, and on Tuesday at this person's house. And it was a relatively easy thing to do. What happened is in the state of Israel, this became state-supported study. And Ben-Gurion was willing to make that deal in 1948, and the deal was originally only for a few hundred in the whole country. But over the course of decades, and given certain politics, certain realities about the political situation and the like, that has now become tens of thousands of these students, not the elite, not the best students, often they're anything but the best students, who are being state-supported to study Torah and nothing but. And as Aaron accurately points out, this is a major issue in Israel because it is a drag on the entire society. Because they're not productive in the sense of the economy, and so therefore the rest of the country is supporting them, and it's reaching, I believe it has already reached. If not, it is reaching a breaking point. So there's no doubt that this can be taken to the extreme. But I don't think that that's what they're talking about here in this passage. It doesn't say anywhere that that's all you should do is study. It just says that you should study, and when you study, it should be lishma, not for some practical reason. Doesn't mean that it also is implying that you shouldn't work and raise a family and do all the other things that you'd need to do with your time. So I don't want to indict this passage with that problem. Yeah. '68. Oh, much more so. It's much more so. So much more so that what we used to call liberal arts are disappearing on college campuses. So try to find foreign languages on lots of on college campuses today. They don't exist anymore. The departments are simply gone. Right. Right. And so there's no doubt about this. I think that, to his credit, my father never pushed me this way. I was the worst of them all. I was a philosophy major. I'm sorry? Okay. when people thought I was insane even when I was a rabbinic student when I was an undergraduate for doing that. I think that I demonstrated that there are uses for such knowledge. But which was not why I was studying it, for the uses. But today, it's become much, much more so. And I believe that is cost-driven. When I was a freshman at the University of Missouri, and I could take as many hours as I wanted, the tuition was $165 a semester. And that was $165 then, is not $165 now, but it's also not in the thousands and thousands that it is today. So even when two of my kids went to Ohio State, and I can tell you that the price has more than doubled since the late 90s and early 2000s when my kids were at Ohio State. More than doubled. Yes? Okay, I don't have any argument with that. You can see that there's a difference between when I was leading Torah study and Torah study now. Unlikely that we would have been looking through it simply through them. But that's not a criticism, just a comment. Okay. I agree with you, Aaron. I don't think it needs to be there at all. Aaron said, what is the last line there for? What difference does it make whether honor is included or not? And I agree. But the text is the text. Okay, so let's look at number 39. I love this passage, this little passage. Rabbi Tarfon. He shows up in the Haggadah, so you may have heard his name before. At camp, we used to refer to him, because the kids laughed every single time, we would refer to him as Rabbi Tarfon. Why they would laugh? But they did every single time. They would laugh. So Rabbi Tarfon and some of the elders were reclining in the upper chamber in the house at Nitza in Lod when this was raised before them. Rabbis, which is greater, study or action? Now, given what we just said about study and relating to God, which is greater, study or action? I would say that there are three ways we relate to God now: study, prayer, deeds. Ma'asim tovim. Okay? Ma'asim tovim, good deeds, doing the right thing, being out in the world, making a positive difference. So here's the question: which is greater, study or deeds? Remember, these are the rabbis, no less. So what would you think they might say? Rabbi Tarfon spoke up and said, action is greater. See, I told you I like this guy. Rabbi Akiba, not one of my favorites, even though he's one of the greats. Rabbi Akiba spoke up and said, no, study is greater. And what do the rabbis, how do they split the difference? How do they square the circle, if you will? Study is greater, for it leads to action. They didn't say that. I interpret this to mean the rabbis agree with Tarfon, but do not want to insult Akiba. You notice what they say: study is greater, for it leads to action, meaning what really matters is the action. The Ma'asim Tovim. But Akiva says study is greater. He's the great old man sitting here with us. We aren't going to embarrass him or insult him, and so we find a way to state it. But really, Tarfon is right, which is a very interesting statement. I just spent 15 minutes talking about the importance of study. Study Lishma, for its own sake, and how we relate to God, and all the rest of it. But when you get to the bottom line, what's the most important thing? Your deeds. It does lead to a kind of action, just no action that you approve of. In my case, it would lead to a lot of sleep. Yes. Well, look at the next passage. 40. Hanina ben Dosa used to say, when a man's good deeds exceed his learning will endure. But when his learning exceeds his good deeds, his learning will not endure. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah used to say, to what may he whose learning exceeds his good deeds be compared? To a tree whose branches are many and roots are few, so that when a wind comes, it uproots the tree and turns it flat on its face. On the other hand, to what may he whose deeds exceed his learning be compared? To a tree whose roots are many and branches are few, so that even if all the winds in the world come and blow at it, they will not move it from its place. What matters? Deeds. If you have to ask, what matters is deeds. You might want to read 41 on your own at some point. We often think that the passage about Sodom and Gomorrah, what is the great sin of Sodom? You know, that whole passage with Lot. And many people think that the business that the people were after Lot is really a story about homosexuality, and that's really what the great sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was all about, not according to the rabbis. The sin, according to the rabbis, is that they were cheaters and unrighteous people, and they took advantage of any kind of stranger. They did everything wrong. It was a completely unjust society, and that's what the Midrash 41 from Sanhedrin 109b is all about. Since that sometimes comes up as evidence of what the biblical opinion is, it's not the biblical opinion in the way the rabbis read it. That's why I wanted you to see it. Okay, let's go to 43. One of my all-time favorite stories. Some of you may even remember that I told this story at least once or twice at a Shir Shabbat over the years. It's a story about Shimon ben Shetach, who was a cotton trader. Now that's interesting in and of itself because it reminds us that the rabbis actually had to make a living. This is Aaron's point. Even the greatest rabbis, and he was one of the greats, you still had to make a living because you weren't going to make a living by studying Torah. So his students said to him, "Master, allow us to buy you a donkey so that you will not have to work so much." They went and they bought him a donkey from a certain non-Jew. Actually, the Hebrew says he was a Saracen. What is another word for Saracen? Arab. He was a Saracen and found upon the donkey a precious stone. Usually the way the story is told, it's a pearl. They came and told him, "Now you don't have to work ever again." Said he, "Why so?" They replied, "We bought you a donkey and found upon it a precious stone." He asked, "Does he know of it?" They replied, "No." He told them, "Go and return it." But they responded, "Did not Rav Huna, Bibi Bar Gazlan say," quoting Rav is one of the great, "It was stated in the presence of Rabbi, even according to the view that stealing from a heathen is forbidden, appropriating his lost property is permitted." In other words, the technicality of the halacha is we didn't steal this. We found it. And according to the halacha, kind of in this version, finders, keepers, losers, weepers. It's perfectly kosher according to the halacha. Why can't we keep it? Why can't you keep it and you won't have to work anymore? And he responded, "What do you think? Shimon ben Shetach is a barbarian?" Now, what is he saying? Why do I like this story so much? Well, he's following the letter of the law. The students are telling him, follow the letter of the law. You don't have to return it. And that's what makes you a barbarian or not. Right? To strictly follow the letter of the law, in this case he's defining as a barbarian. because it's clearly wrong. Well, how do we know? He bought a donkey. He didn't buy a pearl, right? He bought a donkey. He got a pearl. So, or a precious stone, whatever it was, a diamond. And so he knows that the right thing to do, his moral sense, tells him the right thing to do is return it. And when his students give him the halachic argument, which is, this is all that we're required to do, is to follow the halacha, he says, no. It's important to follow the halacha, but your following the halacha has to be guided by a pure moral sense. Right. But treat others the way you want to be treated. But more than that, as a contemporary issue, there's one thing about not breaking the law. It's another question about being immoral. They're not the same question. Yet we have plenty of people in our society who will say, I didn't break any laws. Everything I did was legal. And that's all that matters. That's all that matters. And this story, this little story, I think reminds us that the law is supposed to reflect the morality, not be independent of the morality. Anybody else? Question about that? So you see another one of Rabbi Tarfon's little teachings. I like this. This is also a song. This has become a song. Lots of contemporary writers have taken some of these kind of aphorism-like passages and turned them into music. Kolba Seder did this one. It's not upon you to finish the task, yet you are also not free to desist from it. So why did I check this off? Why did I think we should spend a couple minutes on this? Again, I think it's of contemporary value. It is so easy to say, this is such a big task. There's no way that I'm ever going to be able to make a dent in it. There's no way that I'm ever going to be able to change anything. That my efforts are irrelevant, so why should I even try? People say this all the time, at least that's my experience, whether they're talking about whatever their goal is, one goal or another, changing society, trying to get government to operate better, whether they're going to vote, whatever it is, it's always, I don't make any difference, so I'm not going to bother. And what is this saying? The Hebrew is lo alecha hamlacha ligmor velo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. It's not upon you to finish the task, but you aren't allowed to not try, to desist from it at all. Rita, did you want to say? If it is, it's never going to get done. Yeah, there are no perfect people. So okay. Here it's remarkable to me how sometimes each individual putting in the 2 cents, if you will, can accumulate into something that really makes a difference. There's the opposite version of this too. This story about, I don't remember the details of it, but there's a story about a town who decides that they're going to make a big pot of soup for the whole town. And everybody is supposed to come and put their own vegetables into the soup. And each person, one after another, says, nobody's going to know the difference whether my vegetable is in there or not, and puts in a stone. And at the end, that's what you have, is stone soup, because everybody did that, and all that's in there are stones. It's the same idea, but the reverse. That if everyone says, I'm insignificant, so there's no responsibility to be taken, it can mean that they do nothing. It can mean they do the wrong thing. It doesn't matter what they do because they've already decided that they're too insignificant to matter. If we take that attitude, certainly nothing changes for the good. More likely, if it's going to change, it changes for the worse. And they all put, right. That's the positive way of putting it. Oh, you're thinking of the Honey story. Right, yeah, I told a lot of Honey stories also. There's only 4 or 5 of them, but I told them more than once each. Over 12 years, there's it goes around. Yeah, Honey is the Jewish Rip Van Winkle. He falls asleep. I forget. I think it says for 40 years or something like that, or 200 years. 70 years, yeah. 70 years. And he sees somebody planting a carob tree, and he says, why are you bothering? You're not going to live to draw any fruit from the carob tree. And he says, but my grandchild might. Absolutely. All these are the same kind of point, that we do make a difference. Yes, Rita. Yeah. I thought you were going to say something different, but yeah, I like that. My friend Sanford Kopnick in Cincinnati, one of my rabbi friends, some of you may have met him along the way, he has a sign in his office that says, "Thou shalt not whine," with a W. I always wanted to get one of those, but I never did. Okay, are we ready to go on to 7a? Brachot 7a, number 45. Okay. This is a really interesting passage, which is not so famous, meaning I knew it. I knew it because I was writing something and I came across the passage as I was writing it, and it stuck in my memory. So I'll tell you how I used it in a couple minutes recently. 2 weeks ago I used this. So Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, from where do we know that God prays? Have you thought about this? That God prays. Usually we pray to God. This is a very unusual question that the rabbis are discussing here. Does God pray? As it says, and this is a quote from Isaiah, I will bring them to my holy mountain, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Now, the Hebrew, my house of prayer, is Beit Tefillati. Now, my house of prayer is a perfectly good translation. But the literal translation, Beit, is house of, Tefillati, my prayer. So the passage from Isaiah could read, I will cause them to rejoice in the house of my prayer. Now that's interesting, because if you say house of my prayer, you have concrete evidence from the prophet Isaiah that God prays. Otherwise you can't say, God says, my prayer. What does God pray? All right, so now we've proved that God prays. So the next logical question is, what is the prayer? What might God say? Rabbi Zatra Bartuvia said in the name of Rav, here's God's prayer. May it be my will that my mercy conquer my anger, my mercy be revealed in my attributes, that I treat my children with the attribute of compassion, and I go for them beyond the bonds of strict justice. So, Rabbinic Theology 101. What is Rabbinic Theology 101? That God has two major aspects. One is called Midat Hadin, the aspect of judgment. On Rosh Hashanah morning, that happens. God decides the fate of every individual, right? That's the imagery that we have of Rosh Hashanah morning. That's Midat Hadin. But then God also has Midat HaRachamim, the aspect of mercy or the aspect of compassion. And for the next 10 days, through Rosh Hashanah, all the way to Nila on Yom Kippur, we keep asking God to judge us from compassion and let us off the hook. Because we all deserve judgment. No question about that. Everybody deserves judgment. So therefore, the goal of the high holidays is to get God to forgive us. God will forgive us if God is sitting on the seat, if you will, using the attribute of God's mercy. So what does God pray? May it be my will that I will move from judgment to compassion. Unbelievable passage, I think. All right. Now, you could argue, and there are passages elsewhere in this same part of the Talmud, that the image here is that God gets up every morning like every pious Jew and puts on tefillin and davens this prayer just like Jews do. Maybe even you'll find that kind of passage in the Talmud and you'll say, you see, that's what it means. I think that clearly the rabbis were smarter than that. And they did not think that that's what was going on here. They wanted us to see this God providing us a model for our behavior. Yes. Right. Okay. Absolutely right. And you already know, I've already, put this out there now many times already that I'm not a fan of petitionary prayer. Okay. You're letting reason and logic get the better of you. This is a metaphor. That's why I said the rabbis didn't mean for us to take this literally. Aaron's not the only person who would have said this. They would have said it. All of us would say it. What they're saying is this is an example of how to behave. Follow God's example. And I can give you, I may even have it in this compendium. There's another passage where they use verses to show that God comforts the sick and God takes care of the orphan and God cares about the widow. And so what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to follow God's example and do the same thing. Okay, so I'm absolutely convinced that this is meant to be a metaphor for our behavior. Okay, and I think that the Midrash stands on its own as a terrific inspirational Midrash just there, recognizing that we are to emulate God by viewing the world through compassion and mercy as opposed through the strict letter of the law, judgment. So, right after, I was here helping Karen and Tina with Simchat Torah. Interesting Simchat Torah service. First time in all the years that I've been here that we had a kid puke in the aisle during Simchat Torah. But apart from that, you never know. Every year something new happens. Anyway, and of course the next morning was the pogrom. It turned out that we were planning, and we did, do this. We were going to Chicago the following Friday, where our youngest son lives. And he's still a member of the congregation that I was the rabbi of. He and his family, all of them, including his in-laws. So the person running the show there right now is the cantor who I developed when I was the rabbi there. I hired her, and when she still feels kind of connected to me because I didn't abandon her when she lost her voice, which would have been really easy to do. But she got it back, and so she said, you're going to be here. This is 2 months ago. Why don't you take part in the service like you used to? Lead songs at the beginning, and because we developed this Share Shabbat format when we were in Chicago. That was something I brought with me here. she said, tell a story, do the things that you used to do. People will love that. So that was the plan. And then what happened. And she called me up and she said, we can't do that. It's just not going to work. We can't do a lighthearted service this coming Friday night, the first Friday night following this disaster. But being that you've been living in Israel for the last 8 years, it seems to me that you would be the right person to talk about this. So would you do that? Would you pick music that's appropriate, and then would you talk about it? So I was not thrilled about doing this. It's like I said many times already, if I wanted to keep working, I would have kept working. But I understood her point, and so I agreed to do this, which meant this all happened on Wednesday, which meant that Tuesday. So that meant on Wednesday, I needed to figure out what we were going to do. So what am I going to say? She said, you should have a unique perspective. So what I did is I started out with the usual niceties, that it felt a little strange being on the bima again and looking out and seeing all these faces that I used to see every week, and it was nice to be back, and it was really wonderful that Shelley invited me to do this, one of the best things I'd ever did, and my rabbinate was hiring her. Everybody laughed and applauded. It was all the kinds of things to try to get people to listen that we were talking about before. And then I told them that neither Simone or I are real Israelis. That I don't have anything really insightful or smart to say, that it is too soon, and all I have is feelings. We are not real Israelis, we're citizens, but we never had to work in Israel, and most importantly, we never sent our kids to the army, which is the thing that makes you an Israeli. Either being in the army yourself, but even more importantly, sending your children to the army. Almost more than anything else. And so I said, what I'm going to do is read you a couple comments from our friend, Rabbi Nir Barkin, who has been sending out kind of a daily thing. He's a real Israeli. He has had all 3 of his kids through the army, and what he is thinking. And so I read a little bit of that. I read a little bit of City of Slaughter, which is Bialik's poem about the Kishinev pogroms in what was then the Russian Empire, 1902. 1903, I don't remember, right around early part of the 20th century. And I said we can feel those words washing over us. And why am I telling you this story? Because I said I have one more thought. And I told him this midrash. And I said, why am I telling you this midrash about what God prays? Because at this moment, I am so upset and so distraught and mostly angry that I am not capable of moving from midat hadin to midat harachamim. I'm not capable of seeing the world through mercy as opposed to through righteous indignation. And then I said my prayer, like God's prayer here, is that someday I might be able to recover that. I can tell you that day hasn't come yet. And that's where I ended it. Because this is pointing to something that is real. All of us, I think, particularly right now, we can easily identify with the desire for strict justice, the desire for righteous indignation, feeling righteous indignation. It's difficult to move away from that in certain parts, whether we're talking about a human life or a group of people's life or specific historical event. And so I think that the rabbis here, by telling us what God is doing, is saying to us we have to try to do this, even when it's hard. It's so platitudinous. It's so easy to say, this is what you should do. Try it sometime when you're really angry at somebody else, when you're really hurt by somebody else, when things are conspiring against you and you feel like it's going to be hard to get out the door the next morning, to move from righteous indignation to a sense of compassion. So I think it's actually a really important midrash in terms of what advice it is giving us. Okay. End of the sermon. Anybody want to add anything to this? It's one of those times where, it's like the Shimon ben Shetach story in the donkey. It's where there's really an insight here that can influence your thinking if you let it seep in. Okay. Let's go to 49. Remember we were talking about what it means to be Jewish? So from Yoma. Yoma means Yom Kippur. That's the tractate. The tractate on Yom Kippur is where this is found. Abaye explained, as it is taught, and you shall love the Lord thy God. You know that passage, right? That is, that the name of heaven shall be beloved because of you. If a person studies Scripture and Mishnah and attends to the disciples of the wise, is honest in business and speaks pleasantly to people, what do people then say concerning them? Happy is the parent who taught that person Torah. Happy is the teacher who taught that person Torah. Woe to people who have not studied the Torah, for this person has studied Torah, and look how fine their ways are, how righteous their deeds. Of them, Scripture says, and God said to me, you are my servant Israel, to whom I will be glorified. But if someone studies Scripture and Mishnah, attends to the disciples of the wise, but is dishonest in business and discourteous in one's relations with people, what do people say? Woe to the person who studies the Torah. Woe to their parent who taught that person Torah. Woe to their teacher who taught that person Torah. This person studied Torah. Look how corrupt are their deeds, how ugly their ways. Of them, Scripture says, these are the people of the Lord and are gone forth out of God's hand. In other words, what is God's image in the world? What we do. This is a big-time responsibility. If we behave correctly, and we do that proudly as Jews, people say essentially, blessed is the God of the Jews. And when we behave poorly and are identified as Jews, essentially people say, something's wrong with the relationship with God. This is not the way it's supposed to be. It's an interesting thing because it's putting a very big burden on us, both as humans, but as Jews. Because we reflect Torah in the world. So think about what we said about it's you don't have to complete the task, but you're not allowed to abstain from it. So everything that you do either furthers God's image in the world or detracts from God's image in the world. And don't we know that that's true? Are you like me? Do you watch for the Jewish names at the end of TV programs? You know? How did we feel in the 80s when the name Ivan Boesky came up? Or Michael Milken? Yes, which I don't think he really exists. I think that's a Dickinsonian name. Just think about it. He made off with the money. I mean, really, it's like, it's like, it can't be. That guy can't really exist. But yeah, all of us, we're embarrassed by this. And it's not just it's a kind of personal embarrassment, but it's an embarrassment for who we are as Jews and an embarrassment for what Judaism is supposed to stand for. I think. Do you guys agree with me about that? Do you see that kind of feeling that wells up in us? And also, we take a kind of pride in this. I'm going to use an example that I don't think is a good example, but it's the one that everybody uses. Jews also take tremendous pride in the number of Nobel Prize winners that are Jewish, as if it has something to do with us. Think about that for a second. Sandy Koufax is a barely identifiable Jew who did one very public Jewish thing. Refused to pitch on Yom Kippur. Right. By the way, Hank Greenberg did play when he had the chance, who was every bit as great a ball player. But we remember Sandy Koufax for that one thing because we know that it reflects somehow on us and on our heritage. He had at least enough respect for the heritage to understand that he needed to do something. In this case, not do something, but he needed to be out there, not hide. So it's a very interesting passage, I think, that it is telling us just how important our behavior is. We have time for one more? Yeah, we have time for one or two. So I want to look at number 50, which actually begins on page 15. This is the famous one. I thought we would come near the end. We would do some really famous one that everybody thinks is learned in kindergarten and they think is actually in the Torah. It isn't. Chia said, Terach, Abraham's father, was a manufacturer of idols. He once went away somewhere and left Abraham to sell in his place. A man came and wished to buy one. How old are you? Abraham asked him. 50 years was the reply. Woe to such a man, he exclaimed. You are 50 years old and would worship a day-old object? At this, he became ashamed and departed. On another occasion, a woman came with a plate full of flour and requested him, take this and offer it to them. So he took a stick, broke them, put the stick in the hand of the biggest. When his father returned, he demanded, what have you done to them? I cannot conceal it from you, he rejoined. A woman came with a plate full of fine meal and requested me to offer it to them. One claimed I must eat first, while another claimed I must eat first. Thereupon the largest arose, took the stick, and broke them. The father says, why do you make sport of me? Have they then any knowledge? And what does Abraham say, young Abraham? Should not your ears listen to what your mouth is saying? This is the famous story. What's going on here? Why do the rabbis tell it? Okay. What is the argument against the idols? That's nothing. The idols are nothing. Right? They're just statues. They're nothing. However, how do people relate to them? First of all, a guy 50 years old, which would have been somebody of significant age, although when Abraham hears God's voice, he's 75. But says, I might want to buy one of these. And Abraham makes fun of him, right? You're 50 years old and you're going to buy a statue that's a day old and think it's a god? No, what an idiot. The woman then wants to make an offering because fine meal would have been valuable, right? Can make fine kinds of food out of it. And so she wants to offer it to these gods, which Abraham thinks is completely ridiculous. So he breaks them and then tells this story to his father that the big one broke up all the small ones because they were jealous about the meal. And the father says, that's ridiculous, Abraham. You know they can't move. They can't do anything. And Abraham says, do your ears hear what your mouth is saying, you stupid old man? Really, isn't that the tone that you get? So what does this tell us about Abraham? Why do the rabbis tell us this story? Or both. Even when he was young, he's the right choice that God will make because we can see he's already figured out what idolatry is. Right? He's already figured that out. So that's why God chooses him. So at least the story is told for that reason. To sort of give us a background why at 75 years old God chooses Abram at that point, as opposed to who knows who else. There were no Jews. At this story, there are no Jews. Yeah, the point. Yes, certainly. Look, it is my opinion, that nobody thought that these idols were actually the gods they represented. That's just too difficult for me to believe that people were that silly, just like Abraham says that these are audiovisual devices. These are to help with your concentration, that whatever this one is represents this God, not actually is the God. I feel the same way about the golden calf. I do not believe that the Israelites came out of Egypt after experiencing the miracle of the plagues and the division of the sea and get to Mount Sinai and actually build what they think is a God out of their gold jewelry. It represents a God. And in their view, I think the original story, it represented the God. That this was kind of like a pedestal that God would be upon. It was a visual way of relating to God since Moses had disappeared, and Moses was the visual way of relating to God for them. I think they were just more sophisticated than the story makes them seem. And I think here the same thing is true. It's hard for me to believe that these people actually thought she was going to put that meal down and somehow the stone statue was going to consume it. However, Abraham is playing on the silliness of these particular symbols. If we want to be more sophisticated, and I've tried to say this before, we also have our symbols, which we venerate and we think are important, but you can imagine a Martian landing on Earth and watching what we do and thinking it's silly. What are they doing opening the ark and bowing down and singing to this cabinet that has these scrolls in it that have some words on them? Now to us, it's everything is embodied in those scrolls. And they carry meaning on 100 different levels for all of us, and it's important to us. But imagine how somebody would look at it who's just looking at it without any background, with a kind of cold, objective eye. What does this look like? So I don't know that it was all that different then. They had their kind of religious ideas. They represented them in certain ways. Because we don't buy into that, our term for it is idolatry or mythology. We call it Greek mythology. To the Greeks, it was Greek religion. It wasn't mythology to them. They have representations of God. Of God. And we don't do that? Should I open this up and you want to see how they're decorated? No, but they're decorated with garments and with silver on the top, and they have a belt and that. No, what I'm trying to say is these are not idols in that sense. I have my doubts that these are idols in that kind of childlike sense. Right? Meaning, I think that people have always been a little bit more sophisticated than to believe that statues were actually the deity as opposed to representing the deity. That's all I'm saying. I think we should just give humanity a little credit here as opposed to building this up. It's an easy straw man to knock down. Well, be a little more understanding about how the nature of all religions work. All right, so what do Protestants say about Catholics? At least they used to. Why? Not just of Jesus. And the saints. Now, if you ask them, they will tell you that these are devices that are helpful in terms of their focus and directing them to in a religious way to the God they believe in. Not all of them. Some of them have a naive kind of view also. But we shouldn't assume the naive view is to everyone. And just sort of ignore that we do similar kinds of things, because that's the nature of religious observance, is that you need a focus point. You need some place to become the symbolic representation of the things that you've learned, that you believe, your experiences, your feelings. I don't know if that makes sense or not. You look like you're having a problem. Well, that's good. If you never thought of it that way, now you can go home and think about it that way. Yes, 1, 2, and then we're over our time. But yes, so, all right, so there's a lot. I don't want to oversimplify anything. People often will ask, how can 3 be 1? You hear this from Jews all the time. Let me let you in on a secret. It's a mystery to Catholics, too. That's the whole point. That is exactly the whole point. I would say, how can 2 be 1? We have midat hadin and midat harachamim in the same God. How can 2 be 1? We just insist that it is. Adonai echad. Right? So religious traditions can't be broken down simply into logical syllogisms. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that religious traditions have certain things in common. Did you want to say something? Right. Well, you have. For that person, or for the people for those people. That's right. That's right. So I think that there's a naive kind of approach to these things, but there's a more sophisticated kind of approach also. And since I would like non-Jews to judge Jews and Judaism at our best, not our worst, I am obligated to judge them at their best and not their worst. Okay, everyone. Thanks, everybody. If you look at the very bottom, there's a last idea here which we are not going to discuss, but it's very important. 53, the righteous of all the nations have a share in the world to come. Judaism holds a position that what matters is righteousness more than identity. Just the last thought for you to think about. Thank you, everybody. I'm not sure I understand. Greek Orthodox Christianity uses